So what are your opinions on how the Second Amendment translates into modern day life?
That's a good question. So I would say that the Second Amendment strikes me as being less important today than it was in 1790, whatever, when it was ratified. Because 1789, that sounds right.
Mm-hmm.
Because, the context of the Second Amendment is critical, and it was written primarily because we needed individuals to have weapons so that when they joined militias, they had weapons because there were no state-run armies. And in that context, in reading the first part of the Second Amendment, it becomes clear that the Second Amendment was really critical for national defense. Today, with the standing army having pretty crazy weapons, I'm just not sure that it's relevant in the same way. I do, however, think that from a cultural perspective, having the availability of weapons, especially for hunting, and maybe even to some limited extent for self-defense, makes sense. But I think it's not as critical as it once was.
So you sort of already answered this, but do you believe that the amendment needs to be enforced at the same extent as it was at the founding of the country? Why or why not? And if not, what extent do you think it should be enforced at?
Yeah, so it's a curious question because I can't think of how it was enforced at the founding. Mm-hmm. I think people just had guns and that was how it was. Mm-hmm. And, the most advanced weapon available was not that much more advanced than the least advanced weapon available. So I think that, when we think about enforcement of the Second Amendment, that really depends on how we interpret it. And I think there's certainly more of a need for both interpretation and enforcement of that interpretation now than there was 200 years ago. I don't know if I answered your question.
I think you did. Do you feel that the constitutional right to bear arms is being infringed upon? If so, by whom and why?
No, I don't. Mm-hmm. I don't. If anything, I think it's been interpreted more broadly than it needs to or should be. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What are your opinions on the origin of the increasing mass shootings in our country?
There's a lot of research. I'm going to kind of drift over into another topic, mm-hmm. but it's relevant. There's this really interesting study about the suicide rate in Greenland. Mm-hmm. I think there was a This American Life episode about it, or maybe it was something. It was on a podcast that I listened to. And what they find is that the phenomenon of suicide is contagious within a community. So when one person commits suicide, it makes everyone around them more likely to commit suicide. And I think that we're seeing a similar contagion effect with mass shootings. So when you see one person do it, it becomes more likely that someone else will do it. And it's kind of this really unfortunate feedback loop. So why is it happening? I mean, I don't think that the presence or absence of any one particular weapon makes it more or less likely. My thoughts on that are that, the mass shootings are probably coming because we see so much press coverage of them, and not a glorification, but certainly a notoriety for the people who carry them out and for people who are seeking that kind of attention, even in death. I think it becomes more attractive because of that.
Do you think that a change in culture might be the influence of it, or do you think it's more, again, the contagion effect?
I think it's contagion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To what extent should gun control be used to combat this, in your opinion?
I don't know that controlling the supply of guns would work mm-hmm. to combat it. I would like to see military-style weapons mm-hmm. off the streets, but I also know that as soon as any effort towards that is made, that people will just stockpile them. Mm-hmm.
Why do you support gun control legislation, if you do, and are there any personal experiences that shaped this opinion?
I mean, I think I've always seen reason to think that, for example, background checks, mental health checks, etc., would make a good kind of common sense regulation. People use that word too much, that phrase, but so I've always supported that, and I don't think that anyone should be able to buy a really high capacity gun. I don't know that I've changed that based on personal experience, but certainly I think everyone I know has some story about something going wrong with a gun. I have those, but I don't know that those have informed my opinions.
What was your relationship with guns growing up? Like, did you have them in the home, or?
Yeah, I thought about that a lot. My parents had a handgun, and I think that they bought it because we had a groundhog that would not stop destroying our garden, and they shot it. But that was like a big deal when they got the gun, and it was, hidden away in their closet. And like every child, I was fascinated by this, but also terrified. Mm-hmm. And I'm just really glad that they did not keep it loaded in their closet, because mm-hmm. not that anything would have happened, but, there were lots of kids that came in and out of our house, and I can look back now and say, like, having it at the top shelf of the closet, probably not mm-hmm. the safest thing ever. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What is your opinion on the current political dialogue on guns? Is it constructive or harmful?
Oh, it's completely useless.
Mm-hmm.
It's not harmful or constructive. It's just stupid. Sorry, that's really strong. I think that the NRA has made it impossible to have a reasonable conversation mm-hmm. about guns because they're so absolutist. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of people on the other side who are also absolutists. We should take away all the guns. That's clearly not going to happen. Mm-hmm. But I think most Americans and most politicians, if they're honest with themselves, support something in the middle with, like, background checks, for example. But the NRA has made that so politically unviable mm-hmm. that nothing is happening.
Are you referring to more, media portrayal of the gun debate, or is this more the actual politicians and how they're discussing it and trying to find legislature?
Both, but mostly the rhetoric around mm-hmm. it from politicians. As soon as there's a mass shooting, it's like, oh, this isn't the time. Mm-hmm. But then they never circle back when it is the time. And, there's a mass shooting every day. Mm-hmm. So it's never the time, and that's not good enough. Mm-hmm. That's pointless. Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that there has been more widespread support of the Second Amendment rights as late?
Because the NRA is campaigning on it.
Mm-hmm.
And because you can always motivate people with fear, and the more extreme supporters of gun rights and the NRA have instilled in gun owners a fear that the government's going to take them all away, mm-hmm. even though no one has ever suggested that would ever happen. Mm-hmm. And so it's on the agenda because it's effective in motivating people to vote a certain way.
Why do you think that the people who support gun rights so intensely do so?
Because they've been made to believe that someone's going to take their gun away. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there a reason you think that they cling on to the idea of the gun so much?
There's a part of the American culture that believes that the Second Amendment is there so that if the government becomes kind of tyrannical, that they can, there's been talk about a Second Amendment solution that came up in the Trump campaign. And, that basically suggests that we're going to take our guns and overthrow the government. And I think that there are people who legitimately believe that that's why the Second Amendment is there. I've read a fair amount on this. I haven't been convinced that that's true, but that's just my opinion. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Yeah, I do just want to say, what was it that I was going to say? Yes. My idea I've stolen directly from Chris Rock.
Mm.
Okay?
Okay.
But his idea, which I think is brilliant, is that we don't have to get rid of the guns. We just super regulate the bullets, right? So, like, if every bullet costs $200, then people are going to think before they fire off 100 of them, because that's a serious expense. And, you know, that doesn't require, you know, the Constitution doesn't give you the right to buy bullets. It gives you the right to bear arms. And so, you know, he was being facetious, but I really think that that's the answer. That's easy, right? Inflation, just like make the bullets really expensive. Problem solved.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. Just wanted to share that.